Next is a documentary programme, The Strange Journey of Herman Melville. With contributions from Melville scholars and critics, this fascinating profile explores the forgotten author of Moby Dick, who fell out of favour during his lifetime and whose reputation was only re-established after his death.
In October 1891, the New York Times published an article which cast some light on an earlier, very brief obituary. It noted that an author by the name of Herman Melville had died at his home in New York City, an absolutely forgotten man. For decades before his death, Melville had gone into total eclipse, what the New York Times called a wanton caprice of fame. He had been famous in his day, but that was a long time earlier. The forgotten author was a bearded figure. He stared out from his photographs in a dignified pose. Sea salt, man of letters, a troubled visionary. This was a complex and ultimately even a tragic man, a writer who lost his audience.
Call me Ishmael.
One of the most famous opening lines in English literature, even if you haven't actually gone on to read the monumental book Moby Dick. It's an account of an epic sea voyage on board a whaler ship, the Pequod, in search of a great white whale. Today, of course, the novel is justly celebrated as a masterpiece and published all over the world, a true example of an artist being fully discovered only after his death. When Melville died in 1891, the book had already been out of print for many years. Melville was only rewarded with the respect of later generations. In the 1950s, for example, Moby Dick was turned into a successful Hollywood film.
The land for Melville is a world where things are confused by triviality, and the world of nature, especially the world of the sea, the ocean. And he's one of the few people, by the way, who always referred to the ocean in the masculine as he rather than she. In that world, one finds the naked questions which confront people, which is to say, the relationship of good and evil, the relationship of man to God, if indeed there is a God.
Leslie Fiedler, author and literary critic. It was big metaphysical questions like these which exercised Melville's thought. But Melville, like his narrator Ishmael, could never insist that he knew the answers to these great conundrums. Doubt and scepticism prevailed in his mind. Out of this fascination with the abstract truths behind the universe, he conjured some remarkable literature. He was born in 1819 in New York City, and his family roots were bound up with the early period of American independence. Herschel Parker, who is currently working on the first full-length biography of Melville.
His mother's family was very powerful in New York. They were Dutch who had been there already when Melville was born, a century and a half and more, and they were related to everybody. They were as good a family as you could find in New York. The Boston Melvilles were recent immigrants, mid-18th century, recent by Boston standards. The Bostonian and the Albany families were very respectable, and both of them had a revolutionary hero. This was stimulating stuff for a young boy to grow up with.
But for the young Melville himself, there was to be a catastrophic turn in the family fortunes. His father, a New York merchant, fell into bankruptcy and died when Herman was just 13 years old. This experience of hard times brought Melville's formal education to an early end and must have been intensely humiliating. It certainly made him restless, so not surprisingly, he decided to go to sea at the age of 19.
Melville was never prepared adequately for any role. He simply signed on as a ship's boy in 39 for a voyage to Liverpool and back. He signed on a whaler, sailed at the beginning of 41, and jumped ship in Nukuhiva and got on another ship, which happened to be Australian, and got off in Tahiti and got on another American whaler and signing for the cruise, and got off in Hawaii, and after a while signed on to a U.S. naval frigate. So there's no planning in this. You bum around for a while and you sign on the next appropriate ship. It's a young man having adventures, bumming around. Omu, the title of the second book, means beachcomber, and that's basically what Melville was.
His time at sea gave him the subject matter for a number of his early books, with strange titles drawn from the South Pacific, Taipei, Omu, and Mardi. Starting in 1846, he captivated readers with these stories, mostly set in the South Seas. John Bryant, Professor of English at Hofstra University, New York, and editor for the Melville Society.
Taipei was the record of his experiences on the island of Nukuhiva, living among people that he thinks might be cannibals, and we're not exactly sure, and that's one of the interesting tensions. Everyone associated him as a man who lived among the cannibals. He wanted to be an artist that went beyond that, and he did.
The enormities perpetrated in the South Seas upon some of the inoffensive islanders will nigh past belief. These things are seldom proclaimed at home. They happen at the very ends of the earth. They're done in a corner, and there are none to reveal them. But there is, nevertheless, many a petty trader that has navigated the Pacific, whose course from island to island might be traced by a series of cold-blooded robberies, kidnappings, and murders, the iniquity of which might be considered almost sufficient to sink her guilty timbers to the bottom of the sea.
That passage from Taipei shows that Melville was always doing something more than just spinning yarns and embellishing romances. He had his own sharp observations to make too, and a wide scope for his books.
Moody, which came a couple of years later, is a remarkable South Sea adventure, but it's all fantasy, entirely based upon a kind of political allegorical story and an artistic allegorical story. And then White Jacket detailed the experiences of his Navy life. Redburn is one of the first books that's basically a novel that he wrote, as opposed to a romance. Moby Dick bursts on the scene around 1851, and how can you fully classify that? It's half meditation, half melodrama.
Ishmael begins as a comic figure. He comes as a very naive youth into New Bedford and to Nantucket, and suddenly finds himself conned into sharing his bedroom and bed with a South Pacific native, Queequeg, who is bare-chested and tattooed and
bald and something of a noble savage. And the two end up in each other's arms the next morning in a very fascinating scene that also pushes the boundaries of conventional sexuality to extreme.
I stood looking at him a moment. For all his tattooings, he was on the whole a clean, comely-looking cannibal. What's all this fuss I've been making about, thought I to myself. The man's a human being, just as I am. He has just as much reason to fear me as I have to be afraid of him. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian.
Even in a sailor's last night on shore, where you might expect him, on shipboard you can say, well, there are no women, so what do you expect? But the last night on shore, Ishmael, instead of cruising the streets and looking for a woman, as sailors generally do, ends up with a Polynesian harpooner. And as he said, in our heart's honeymoon, Queequeg and I lay a cozy, loving pair. So what Melville is truly interested in are either affirmative and life-saving relations involving men on both sides, or deeply erotic and passionate relations between men in which they destroy each other.
Ishmael and Queequeg sign up for a voyage on the Pequod under the command of the strange, domineering Captain Ahab. Of course, this is no ordinary mid-19th century whaler, nor is Moby Dick a conventional novel of its time. For a long while and many pages, the ship appears to drift, and Melville enjoys the art of digression, and seems to taste his own words.
Some days elapsed. Ice and icebergs all astern. The Pequod now went rolling through the bright Quito spring, which, at sea, almost perpetually reigns on the threshold of the eternal August of the tropic. The warmly cool, clear, ringing, perfumed, overflowing, redundant days were as crystal goblets of Persian sherbet, heaped up, flaked up with rosewater snow.
He stumbled onto books with a kind of avid delight and completely devoured them. And when he writes, particularly in something like Moby Dick, he almost ventriloquizes.
Christopher Bixby, Professor of American Literature at the University of East Anglia.
He was completely taken over by Shakespeare, especially by King Lear. He had a great love of the Bible. And if you read Moby Dick, it's almost necessary to read it aloud. Sometimes he takes you to the very edge of absurdity as he creates this vast Lear-like character in Ahab.
Well, it is an obsession, and I think that is both the appeal of it and also the terror of Ahab. It's one thing to sit back on a wet Sunday afternoon reading Moby Dick and reading those wonderful speeches that Ahab gives, those speeches of defiance and of personal individualism and power. But no one on earth would want to be stuck in the middle of the Atlantic or Pacific or Indian Oceans with this one-legged maniac tromping up and down the boards telling you to go after a white whale that may or may not exist. I mean, here's a man who is clearly a candidate for a mutiny. What is brilliant about him, of course, is his ability to manipulate the crew. This is not a ship that they had booked for.
But Moby Dick, as a book, is more than just an adventure story. The whale itself carries its own freight of symbolic meanings.
Some choose to see it as the manifestation of goodness, some the manifestation of evil, as well they might, in a world that had derived from a Puritan ideal and a Puritan idea. And bear in mind, of course, that the Puritans themselves dealt in symbols. Nothing that occurred lacked meaning. Everything was a sign. Everything signified something. If a snake wriggled across the path in front of you, it meant something. If your house burnt down, it meant something other than sheer carelessness. It meant something was awry in your relationship with God. And Moby Dick operates that way in that novel. It becomes the focus for whatever it is the individual seeks. And that may be something banal, it may be something simply the capture of an animal to reduce it to its ordinary banal elements, oil, whale meat, blubber, and so on. Or as in the case of Ahab, it may mean the quintessence of something in the universe, in the world at large. So in trying to harpoon Moby Dick, this animal, they were in a way mimicking the attempt to pin down the meaning of America.
Whatever the true meaning of America was, or is, the span of Melville's life across a large part of the 19th century happened to coincide with the extraordinary development of the country, from its beginnings as a fledgling democracy, through the trauma of the Civil War period, to its modern role as a great industrial power.
The thing about America at that time was that it was unformed. It still consisted of wide open spaces. The frontier wasn't even declared formally closed till 1890. And that meant that the question of the definition of what it was to be an American, the definition of the country and the culture, was still available for debate. It was just inchoate. It was like the universe before it began to distill into planets and suns and moons.
After Moby Dick, Melville turned from the sea to the land for many of the settings of his fictions. There was Pierre, a dark story with overtones of incest. But more remarkably, in the 1850s, various tales, short stories, when he began some interesting experiments.
Some of his short stories are remarkable experiments in narrative technique, and by that I mean he was playing around not with just the first-person narrators, as he did with his early works, but with third-person narrators and unreliable narrators who seem to be cheating you a little bit, or narrators who are so incredibly stupid themselves that they don't quite understand what is going on in the story that they're telling.
I am a man who, from his youth upwards, has been filled with a profound conviction that the easiest way of life is the best. Hence, though I belong to a profession proverbially energetic and nervous, even to turbulence at times, yet nothing of that sort have I ever suffered to invade my peace. I am one of those unambitious lawyers who never addresses a jury or in any way draws down public applause, but in the cool tranquillity of a snug retreat do a snug business among rich men's bonds and mortgages and title deeds. All who know me consider me an eminently safe man.
The narrator introduces himself in Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener.
Bartleby comes into a Wall Street law office and works very diligently for a while, and then finally simply says, I prefer not to do any more work. And the entire office becomes chaotic. Finally, Bartleby is shipped off to the tombs as a kind of homeless and displaced person, He curls up in front of a wall, a white wall, by the way, and like a white whale, and dies.
It's a deeply ambiguous story, because is this a celebration of the individual standing alone, rather like Ahab, and refusing connectiveness? Or is it an indictment of a person who fails to realise that he exists in a social world and must play a social role?
Whatever the ambiguities in Bartleby and other stories, it's clear that Melville did have things to say about America and the world beyond. But he couldn't be a straightforward commentator by any means.
It's not easy for him to take political stands, because in order to take a political stand, you have to say yes to something, even as you say no to something else. And insofar as you say yes, you lie. Melville's a profoundly apolitical, even anti-political writer. Occasionally there are things which rise up in him, but they're quite superficial. He was against missionaries, for instance, meddling with life of the native cultures in the Pacific. He was against flogging in the United States Navy and the other navies of the world. But those are not the ultimate questions which concern him. He takes off from such current social and political concerns and moves toward a metaphysical world. His world is not ideological but mythological.
Melville's artistic reputation began to crumble after the publication of Moby Dick. The book wasn't fully and properly appreciated. Its complexities of form and content made it easy to misunderstand. And the conditions of Melville's own life were to become shaky. By this stage, he was married and supporting his children on the limited income from his books. Inevitably, he was soon in debt, an echo of his father's misfortunes.
He was so sure that he was writing a great book, and of course he was right, but he was also so sure that anything that great would be popular, and he was wrong. And he was sure he could pay this off in a few months when Moby Dick was published, or The Whale he was still calling it at that time. And the American reviews contained a great deal of praise, but Melville had offended the religious sensibilities of a lot of American editors and readers.
Of course, Melville's real achievement was acknowledged later, and what he wrote, Moby Dick in particular, certainly lasted well beyond the carping of the critics of the day.
I think it's quintessentially a book that escapes from the fashions of any time in which it's written. It seemed out of place in the 19th century, but attractively out of place. It seemed out of place in the 20th century. I think it was rediscovered by modernist writers who were looking for something that escaped from the flux of time and that was not trapped in history. If one wants to call that modern, that's just flattering modernity.
I think American readers were sheerly baffled by the later part of his career. They responded enthusiastically to what they took to be the simple travel books from the beginning, books like Taipei and Umu. Although those books were actually never as simple as they appeared to be, buried within them, as you would expect from Melville, as a series of symbols, of ciphers to be cracked. Well, the American reading public didn't crack those ciphers or even perceive them as being ciphers. They read them as good, rollicking stories of life in the South Seas. That popularity began to wane when he wrote these rather more metaphysical, quizzical, ambiguous works. There was no real market for it then.
As his readership fell away, Melville even reached the point of renouncing prose altogether after the publication in 1857 of The Confidence Man, the book that he called, perhaps with a touch of irony, Our Comedy. He took to writing poetry, reams and reams of it, published privately with financial help from individuals. These volumes hardly sold, and they were generally mediocre compared to the prose works. Melville's family found reason to worry about his state of mind. His behaviour at home became more erratic, even disturbed at times, and there were rumours that he was now a domestic tyrant, impossible to live with. His father-in-law paid his passage on more than one recuperative voyage. During a stopover in the English city of Liverpool, Melville met up again with his old friend and fellow novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was US consul there. Hawthorne was extremely worried at Melville's state of mind, restless as ever, but almost possessed by demons, condemning him to wander over deserts of nothingness. Hawthorne wrote, "He can neither believe nor be comfortable in his unbelief. and he's too honest and courageous not to try to do one or the other.
Herman was to be treated as a strained and strange person with extreme needs, which made him very hard to live with. And everyone in the family on both sides agreed that the thing to do, they agreed from 52 on, the thing to do was to get him out of authorship and into some safe government job abroad, at home, a consul somewhere, some kind of job. Finally, at the end of 66, a custom house job at $4 a day, and for 19 years. That at least got him out of the house in the day.
His life was a total shambles at the end. One of his sons committed suicide. Another sort of disappeared and became a kind of homeless person and died out of touch with his family. His marriage seems to have been a lifelong truce with a wife who never understood him, who called everything that he did, all his more extravagant thoughts, insanity. And so finally he actually lived, in a little private room in his own house, decorated chiefly in black, and he communicated chiefly with himself.
Until his death in 1891. But typically, perhaps, the mystery of Melville didn't end there. In the months before he died, at the age of 72, he wrote one last work, in prose again, The Story of Billy Budd. The manuscript was discovered later and published, leaving a haunting note after a life which had been so thwarted. For this final story, which was also turned into an opera by the British composer Benjamin Britten, Melville returned to the sea. The story takes place in 1797.
A young sailor strikes a superior officer because he stutters and can't get words out, so he acts rather than speaks. And he must be sacrificed because the captain of the ship, Captain Veer for truth, has got to serve the interests of the community and the society. This was the time, remember, when there was revolution in Europe and there was a threat of revolt in the fleet. So a man has to sacrifice somebody who he believes is the quintessence of innocence to serve a higher purpose being the coherence of the society.
What's at stake in Billy Budd is one of the fundamental questions which have disturbed people for all time, and that is the question of what is the role of law and those who enforce the law. When one considers the law as being enforced on human beings who are basically irrational and uncontrollable, who know in one sense that they must be controlled by the law, but know in another sense that the law somehow falsifies the truest depths of human nature. So that in Billy Budd, which is a story of a man who dies unjustly, the author, I think, asks us finally to identify, and identifies himself not with the character of Billy Budd, but with the character of Captain Veer, who judges Billy Budd, sentences him to death, and himself suffers a worse fate, a long, lingering death, totally alienated from the world and from himself.
It wasn't until 30 years after his death, in the 1920s, that Melville and his writings were rediscovered and given a prominent place in the canon of literature. And there was a biography which sparked this new and more powerful interest in his books. Today, his fictions are still rich mines where readers can quarry for the meaning behind the words, or just enjoy the technical mastery of the prose. Melville's presence, 100 years after he died, remains strangely unique. The storyteller is supreme.
He was very much a one-off. It's very difficult to see Melville's influence on subsequent writers. There is nobody quite like Melville. He may have himself absorbed influences from Shakespeare, the Bible, and so on. It's very difficult to see any way in which he passed that on. He stands as this great monument. He stands as the great white whale. He just is. He's a fact of existence. And there is no way of dealing with that but just to shrug and say, there he stands, immutable. Probably the finest writer that America produced in the 19th century.
There are certain queer times and occasions in this strange mixed affair we call life, when a man takes this whole universe for a vast practical joke, though the wit thereof he but dimly discerns, and more than suspects that the joke is at nobody's expense but his own. However, nothing dispirits, and nothing seems worth while disputing. He bolts down all events, all creeds and beliefs and persuasions, all hard things, visible and invisible, never mind how knobby, as an ostrich of potent digestion gobbles down bullets and gun-flints. And as for small difficulties and worryings, prospects of sudden disaster, peril of life and limb, all these, and death itself, seem to him only sly, good-natured hits, and jolly punches in the side bestowed by the unseen and unaccountable old joker.